protects America's interests overseas, advances its forward interests, and more particularly, it figures out how to do that and what the foreigners are looking at and where the bridging points are, how you're going to influence people. It isn't just sending messages. In fact, very few cultures are prepared to deal electronically on sensitive issues. One is that the embassies which we run overseas are platforms for the entire federal government. At the level of the ambassador, you run everything. 36 different cabinet departments and agencies are overseas, and we have to keep them from bumping into each other. Secondly, we have to constantly report on the efficiency of policy and recommend how policy could be changed to achieve the goals that national leaders have laid out. Years ago, my father was teaching at UCLA, and we had all sorts of strange foreigners and diplomats wandering through the house, and I got a taste for it. They're both about policy. Diplomacy, they're both complex in their own way. But diplomacy begins before war, continues during war, and remains after war. We have to put the pieces together, short of situations maybe like World War II, where you have total defeat. It's the diplomats that have to pick up the pieces, make something out of it, and keep a process moving. Well, we were attacked several times by mobs. In part, they were trying to provoke violence with the government really about internal Bahraini issues. So we were sort of an excuse for a violence they wanted to provoke. And we had one incident where they got over the wall because the government had left very strict instructions for its own troops to restrain themselves because they knew the demonstrators were trying to provoke them. After that, the government stepped up its procedures. We had one day when we were cut off by crowds for about 4 hours, and the mob was storming the police line every 15, 20 minutes. They'd come running up throwing stones, and the police would shoot tear gas. I sat up on the roof of the embassy and watched it, and they eventually gave up and moved off. When they're all around you, there's no exit strategy. I would have defended the embassy. Well, the immediate precipitating cause was taking the Shah into Iran, taking the Shah into the United States. And in fact, as you may have heard from others, Chargé Langen warned the administration that if they did that, the government of Iran would end up breaking off relations and quite possibly taking the embassy again. And I think John Limbert can talk in much more detail if you haven't talked to him about that. Bruce Langen was quite precise about what the danger was, and the administration decided to accept that danger and accept the danger to our diplomats. The bunkers were particularly a bomb function, I think, but the bunkers are a function of Washington's political sensitivity to letting us continue to accept the risks we need to accept. We've had risks as long as I was in the Foreign Service. We had people assassinated every year that I was in Iran in the 70s. I had an embassy in Yemen where I was the deputy, and we were told people were going to come up and try to assassinate me and burn the embassy. You talked about having mobs in Bahrain. I've known a number of people who were killed. We've had several ambassadors killed. So this has always been a constant. We went through the hijacking period. We went through assassination periods. We lived with that really until Benghazi. We had periods where we stepped up security, as after the bombings, big bombings of our embassy in Nairobi in Tanzania. That was where we realized that we couldn't assess risk on a country-by-country basis, because risk could come from outside the country. And after each increase in risk and loss of life, we have added security measures but gone on. The fact of Benghazi and the way it has been politicized in our domestic debate has made Washington, frankly, scared of taking any losses, and I think that will continue whichever party has the next administration. So it is a political function to shut up our diplomats and not take losses. It's not a commentary on the Foreign Service. I think it was the first time the American public became aware of the risks. I don't think it was much of a turning point. I mean, we continued to lose diplomats after. We lost diplomats before. We had, same time we had the hostage crisis, we had our ambassador assassinated in Afghanistan. We later lost an ambassador in Sudan. Well, we had the ambassador and deputy who were killed in Sudan. I guess that was before. We had ambassador sort of accidentally killed when they were storming his embassy in Cyprus, which was earlier as well. None of those things woke people up. So you may be right that it woke people up. I don't know that it significantly changed what we did. That was primarily negotiated by the top level of the Carter administration. No, I don't think that incident affected the mindset within the Foreign Service. I mean, it was only 3 years later when I was serving in Yemen, and we didn't even have a security officer, and we were dealing with threats to assassinate me, and I was carrying a weapon. We also dealt with threats after Sabra and Shatila to come burn the embassy with a Palestinian mob, and we went about our business. It's a little bit subjective, but we will take families out a long time before we'll take the diplomats out, and certainly children out. People are willing to, diplomats are willing to tolerate a lot more risk for themselves than they are for their families or their children, and we respect that. We had, well, my wife and I had 6 years of separated tours out of my last 12 years in the Foreign Service. I was in 3 posts that were deemed critical threat. I don't know how common it is. It certainly is not, it's not an aberration. Whether it's more than 50%, I don't know, but most officers nowadays will have to expect at least 1 separated tour, and certainly evacuations are common. Assuming the evacuation is ordered and not, I mean, Saigon was the city's falling, at which point it's the military getting you out. But under normal circumstances, when normal can be pretty hairy, it'll be the Foreign Service that is shepherding the people out, just as the Foreign Service in the evacuation from Libya during the war sent people into Benghazi, chartered the ship, brought people out. So it's a fundamental piece of our work is to arrange for the evacuation of others. The Foreign Service is a major promoter of jobs and assistance to U.S. business. And some of that's done by the Foreign Commercial Service, which is a partner with us, but they're only in a few embassies. In a lot of places, the embassy will be absolutely key for small, medium-sized businesses that are new to market, that don't know their way around. And they'll come in to see us first to figure out who to meet with or where to go. In some places, just routine stuff. In Algeria, I remember we had to help people figure out how to make bank transfers. I think over time, the mission of promoting American business has become more central. It's now something that every diplomat understands as part of our job. Foreign Service is not adequately funded. It is not funded in order to do proper professional education and training for its staff. Military does this very well. Foreign Service has the same requirement, but has no extra people except for language training to pull out. It's the only profession compared to medicine, law, university teaching, which has no requirement for continuing education or certification because it lacks the ability to take people offline to train them. Because we did a lousy job when we had an amateur service of people who didn't know what they were doing. It's part of the same process led all through the 19th century to getting away from the spoils system and promoting by merit. Do you want your country represented by people who simply have political connections and think they're good, or do you want a professional service that's promoted on merit and prepared to take danger in stride? And one of the problems with a non-merit service is they don't tend to want to go to the hard places. I've had so many great assignments. In some ways very early, when I was consul in Tabriz in Western Iran and had 20% of Iran to run around in and a war to report on in Iraq, and we didn't have email yet, so I was away from the flagpole. But equally, being ambassador in Afghanistan, despite the risks, was a fascinating capstone. It's yet one more way in which Washington can try to micromanage. That's sometimes useful and sometimes not. It has not removed the need for face-to-face contact with foreigners. But what it has done is it's both speeded up things, and at the same time it leaves a lot of room for confusion. The old telegram, which wasn't really a telegram, but we called it that, at least had the virtue that you knew the product had been staffed, which was sometimes cumbersome, but it meant you could rely that the instruction was really an instruction. With email, you have the tendency for all kinds of people in Washington to send you something that looks like an instruction, but which, if you act on it, won't actually be supported. So you have to be very careful with email. It's a huge assistance. At the same time, it's also exhausting, because it creates a climate where people expect people in the field to work 24 hours a day, given the time differences with Washington. So it's both a burden and a blessing, but the reality is it's here, and the question is to learn to use it effectively and not be done in by it. For a great many countries, you don't have a lot of information coming out in a timely manner. Academics produce studies, but they produce them slowly. News stories tend to be highly fragmented. If you try to make a balanced judgment on Afghanistan from news, you might as well just be pushing paper airplanes out the window for the quality of the product, because they're much too anecdotal. And for balance, you need to know people. You need to be able to make judgments about what can influence foreign leaders. Press reporting is normally about useless for that kind of judgment. So it's not just a matter of reporting facts, it's a matter of judging the facts and doing it in a timely manner. You have timeliness from news, you have judgment from academics. They don't come together. There is a relationship, often a very good relationship. I always talk to the press. The mainline American media was very good in terms of respecting rules of engagement. Whether some of you are on the record or off the record, you've got to be a little more careful with foreign press. I think we need to talk to the press because we need to convey understanding to the Americans. And one other thing, going back to your other question, you can always cut and splice. A great many countries are no longer covered regularly by the Western news at all. And when something happens, crisis erupts, news media parachute in reporters who are completely uninformed about anything on the ground. Usually the first place they go is the embassy for a briefing. Algeria was an example that there was a crisis. It was a major oil and gas exporter to the United States. There were no American journalists based there. They would come occasionally. They would come to the embassy to ask us to find sources for them. And in many cases, they didn't speak French, so we either had to arrange interpreters, or they could arrange interpreters, but we would have to arrange English-speaking contacts, which meant you get a very limited slice. You saw that again in Egypt. How much reporting did you see that came out of English-speaking Egyptians on Tahrir Square? When the revolt went down, it was the Muslim Brotherhood that won the election. You didn't get that from news reporting. We got it. I mean, anybody who was paying serious attention with analysts, including diplomats, was reporting their strength. But the bias of the news media was to people who could speak on camera in English. To enable ourselves to lead in the whole broad arena, what we call the interagency, of issues that are both domestic and foreign at the same time, while still doing all the rest of our job. People talk a lot about how many new issues there are for diplomats to deal with, which is totally correct. I often point out to people, though, that there are no significant issues that a 19th century diplomat dealt with as major areas that you don't still have to deal with. So everything new is an add-on on top of everything old, but doesn't replace it. You have to be able to do both. I think there are at least, well, let's see. One huge misunderstanding is that it's kind of a spoiled rich person's profession that doesn't go into risk. The fact that we have filled up a whole plaque in the State Department with people who've lost their lives just since World War II is missed by the American public. I think the fact that we have to clean up after military engagements is a complete mystery. Anyway, that's probably two of the biggest. I think probably there is a huge lack of understanding of how vital diplomacy is to our national security. People entering the Foreign Service are incredibly bright. They're diversified ethnically, gender, nationally, geographically. Because of that very broad diversity, they don't have an equal background in international relations, and therefore there is a large responsibility for the State Department to professionalize the excellent people we get, bring them to a high level of professional excellence, and that we don't do very well because we're not funded and organized to do it. Colin Powell, I believe, so Mark Grossman can speak to this more clearly, but I believe Colin Powell said at one point that the Foreign Service takes in a higher level of people than the Army, but the Army does far more to train what it gets. Well, we had several different, now remember, these were mob attacks, not terrorism, so it was a different issue. Some of it was a matter of how we tightened up our relations with the local security forces to make sure we would get help in a pinch. There was a period where we brought in some extra help from the Navy base in case we needed it, but we didn't. But the people weren't being threatened on the street, so what we had to worry about a little was how we get more information so that if there's a flash mob in the street, we're able to warn people so they don't drive into it accidentally. But it wasn't a question of assassinations or things. I mean, it wasn't like the security protocols I had to deal with in Algeria or Iraq or Afghanistan. Well, I mean, some things are fundamental. We work generally, diplomats work generally, on the basis that basic security has to be provided by the host government. We're not an occupying force. We don't have an army with us. And we can up our security in certain kinds of situations, but short of war situation. I mean, Iraq, Afghanistan, these places where we're engaged in war, that's a different story. But for most places, we're not going to have military deployed. So if your fundamental calculation about the host government is wrong, then you're effectively at the mercy of the mob. You have to have threats that are credible and that you feel you no longer can, what we say, mitigate. You can't find ways to reduce them or to balance them. It's not a question of the absolute degree of threat, but it's a combination of how much threat, what can you do to reduce that threat, to take precautions against it, and how important is the job you're doing. If the country is of very little importance to us, then you might say that at a fairly low level of risk, you don't need to take it, go away. In Yemen right now, you have a very high level of risk to our diplomats, but you've got a very fluid political situation where you've got all kinds of tribal players, foreign players, and in order to make sound policy, the American government really has to understand what those different parties are striving for. And you can only do that by talking to them on the ground. So given that Yemen is a country in which the Islamic State now has roots, Al-Qaeda has roots, it's next to oil-producing countries, it's an important place. You need that diplomatic presence, if you can possibly maintain it, in order to know enough to make sound policy and not just be taking wild guesses.